Imagine a ship 3 times more deadly than the Titanic, a ship that carried over 10,000 souls on a freezing night in the final days of World War II, a ship whose name you've likely never heard, MV Wilhelm Gustloff. On January 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Nazi-occupied East Prussia, a desperate evacuation unfolded. Mothers with children, wounded soldiers, and terrified civilians, all crammed onto one ship, hoping for safety across the icy Baltic Sea. But what happened next remains the deadliest maritime disaster in history. In less than an hour, the Wilhelm Gustloff was struck by torpedoes from a Soviet submarine and sank into the dark, frozen sea. Over 9,000 people died. Most of them were women and children. Their cries were muffled by war, and their story almost erased from history. Why is this tragedy so unknown? Why did the world forget the worst shipwreck ever recorded? And was this a justified act of war, or an unpunished war crime? Tonight, we uncover the shocking truth about MV Wilhelm Gustloff, a forgotten ghost of history, silenced by politics, buried in ice and lost in time. Stay with me. This is a story you'll never forget. MV Wilhelm Gustloff was never meant to be a symbol of death. When she was launched in 1937, she stood proud as a crown jewel of Nazi Germany's Strength Through Joy Kraft Freude cruise program, a luxurious floating resort built to showcase national pride and unity. Named after Wilhelm Gustloff, a Nazi propagandist assassinated in Switzerland, the ship became both a political statement and a propaganda tool, boasting a capacity for nearly 2,000 vacationers and a modern design praised by Germany's elite. But like so many things born of war and ideology, the ship's fate was destined to change. As World War II erupted, the once luxurious liner was stripped of its leisure trappings and converted into a hospital ship, then later into a floating barracks, and eventually an evacuation vessel, its polished floors replaced with worn boots, crying infants and wounded soldiers. By January 1945, the Eastern Front was collapsing. The Red Army was advancing with unstoppable momentum, and civilians were caught in the crossfire. Operation Hannibal, one of the largest maritime evacuations in history, was launched to rescue German refugees fleeing East Prussia. The Wilhelm Gustloff was chosen as one of the major vessels, hastily loaded with over 10,000 people far beyond her intended capacity. She was overcrowded, underdefended, and steaming through a frozen war zone. The conditions were desperate. The ship, once a beacon of engineered optimism, had become a vessel of last hope. What happened next would shock the world, if the world had remembered. Instead, the tragedy of the Wilhelm Gustloff faded into the background of history, overshadowed by political narratives, post-war guilt, and the towering myth of Titanic. But tonight we tell her story, unflinchingly and completely. The story of MV Wilhelm Gustloff begins not in war, but in propaganda. Built in 1937 by the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg, Germany, she was designed to embody Adolf Hitler's vision, a unified, classless society, a luxury liner for the common man. Operated under the Nazi leisure organization Kraft Freude. Strength Through Joy, the ship offered German workers state-sponsored cruises to Scandinavia, Portugal, and Italy. She could accommodate nearly 1,900 passengers in modest yet elegant cabins, all treated equally regardless of class, a powerful propaganda tool for the Third Reich. Named after Wilhelm Gustloff, the Nazi leader of the Swiss branch of the party, who was assassinated in 1936, the ship quickly became a symbol of national martyrdom. A bronze bust of Gustloff was placed on board, and the vessel was christened with all the grandeur expected of a political icon. But as war loomed in 1939, the ship's mission changed dramatically. At the outbreak of World War II, the Wilhelm Gustloff was commandeered by the German Navy and repurposed as a hospital ship. Painted white with large red crosses, she served briefly in the North Sea and Norway, transporting wounded soldiers. Later, she became a floating barracks for U-boat trainees anchored in Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, Poland, essentially sidelined from action for much of the war. However, by early 1945, the tides of war had turned catastrophically for Nazi Germany. The Soviet Red Army was sweeping through Eastern Europe, and millions of German civilians were desperate to escape the advancing front. It was in this context that Wilhelm Gustloff was called into service once more, not as a hospital nor a cruise liner, but as an overloaded lifeboat for tens of thousands fleeing annihilation, a ship born of ideology, now burdened with desperation. By January 1945, East Prussia was collapsing under the crushing weight of the Soviet Red Army. Millions of civilians, most of them women, children, and elderly, were caught between brutal winter and advancing forces. Operation Hannibal was launched as a desperate attempt by the Kriegsmarine to evacuate these refugees across the frozen Baltic Sea. Among the ships chosen was the MV Wilhelm Gustloff. Originally designed to carry less than 2,000 passengers, she was now packed with more than 10,000 people, many with no seats, no lifeboats, no hope but to pray they made out alive. At 12:30 p.m. on January 30th, the Wilhelm Gustloff departed from Gotenhafen, heading west toward Kiel. She sailed through treacherous, ice-strewn waters with minimal escort and dim navigation lights to avoid Soviet detection. But in trying to steer clear of German mines, she entered deeper waters, where danger lurked unseen. Just after 9 p.m., Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, spotted the ship. At 9:16 p.m., he fired 3 torpedoes that struck with devastating precision. One hit the forward crew quarters, another the swimming pool area now filled with young female auxiliary personnel, and the last near the engine room. Chaos erupted. Lights failed, temperatures plunged, and the overburdened ship began listing rapidly. Many passengers were trapped below deck. Few lifeboats could be launched in time. In less than an hour, the Wilhelm Gustloff was gone, swallowed by the freezing Baltic Sea. The ship's captain, Friedrich Petersen, did survive the disaster, though he was later court-martialed for negligence. Thousands of others weren't so fortunate. The death toll? Unthinkable. But the full scale of the tragedy would only become clearer in the days that followed, marking one of the darkest nights in maritime history. It was 9:16 p.m. on January 30th, 1945, when 3 Soviet torpedoes, silent and unseen beneath the ice-choked Baltic, struck the MV Wilhelm Gustloff with lethal precision. The ship groaned violently under the impact. The first torpedo tore through the bow, obliterating the crew's quarters. The second hit the former swimming pool area, where hundreds of young female naval auxiliaries, many barely older than children, were sleeping. The third slammed near the engine room, knocking out power and plunging the ship into darkness. Panic erupted instantly. Within seconds, corridors filled with choking black smoke. Below deck, thousands of refugees, many of them mothers with children, elderly civilians, and wounded soldiers, found themselves in complete darkness, trapped in narrow passageways and sealed compartments. Doors jammed, stairwells collapsed, and the freezing air filled with screams. On the outer decks, chaos reigned. Lifeboats were frozen to their riggings. Panicked passengers pushed past one another, slipping on icy decks as the ship began to list rapidly to port. Only a few lifeboats were successfully launched. Many people jumped into the sub-zero water, hoping, praying, gasping. The Baltic Sea, merciless and black, swallowed them whole. Some accounts speak of mothers tying their children to themselves before leaping into the water. Others describe young boys trying to rescue siblings before being dragged under by waves or sucked down by the suction of the sinking hull. Within 40 minutes, the Wilhelm Gustloff disappeared beneath the waves. In total, it's estimated that over 9,000 people perished in that single night, making it the deadliest ship sinking in recorded history. Nearly 5,000 of the dead were children. To put that in perspective, the Titanic, whose name echoes through history, lost around 1,500 souls. The Wilhelm Gustloff? 6 times more. And yet, most people have never heard of her. No other maritime disaster, wartime or peacetime, claimed so many lives. Not Lusitania, not the ferry Donapaz, not even modern-day disasters come close. This wasn't just a sinking. It was a human catastrophe on an unfathomable scale. Thousands of lives, lost in silence beneath frozen waters, forgotten by time and buried under politics. The Wilhelm Gustloff's death toll remains the highest of any shipwreck in history, a title no vessel should ever bear. The sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff was not merely a maritime accident. It was a full-scale human catastrophe, eclipsing every other ship disaster in history. While the Titanic is remembered for its 1,500 lost souls and Lusitania for its political fallout, the Wilhelm Gustloff remains the deadliest ship sinking of all time, claiming the lives of an estimated 9,400 people in a single night. Among them were nearly 5,000 children. Yes, children. Infants wrapped in wool. Toddlers clinging to their mothers. Older siblings trying to help their younger ones into the freezing waters. Families had boarded the ship seeking safety from the Soviet advance. But instead, they sailed directly into their own grave. And it happened fast. Most of the passengers never even reached the upper decks. Locked doors, failed lighting, and overcrowded passages meant thousands were trapped below when the ship lost power. The torpedoes had struck vital areas, including crew quarters and medical compartments, killing hundreds instantly as the ship listed and sank within 40 minutes. Very few had time to react, let alone escape, but there were survivors. Roughly 1,200 people were rescued by nearby vessels, including torpedo boats and fishing ships that braved the icy waters. Survivors spoke of horror, the cries of drowning children, the silence of the dead-filled sea, and the shock of being plucked from near death while friends and family vanished beneath the waves. The ship that was supposed to be their salvation became their tomb. To this day, no other ship in recorded history has taken more lives in a single sinking. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff stands alone as the deadliest shipwreck of all time, a tragedy of forgotten magnitude, and an enduring wound in the history of human displacement and war. The sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff remains one of the most haunting maritime tragedies of all time, not only because of the scale of death, but because of the moral, legal, and historical ambiguity that surrounds it. For decades, historians, survivors, and naval experts have debated whether this catastrophe was simply a consequence of war or something far darker. At the heart of the debate lies a single question. Was the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff a war crime? From a strictly legal perspective, the ship was a military target. By January 1945, the Gustloff had been commandeered by the Kriegsmarine German Navy and was used to transport naval personnel, wounded soldiers, and anti-aircraft gunners. Armed and under military command, she no longer qualified as a protected civilian vessel under international maritime law. However, the reality on board was more complex. Among the roughly 10,000 people aboard were thousands of civilian refugees, women, children, and elderly who had no role in the war. The ship flew no Red Cross flags and was escorted by a single torpedo boat, yet was carrying an enormous load of innocent non-combatants. For some historians, this dual-use nature challenges a clear-cut notion of legitimate target. The Soviet submarine S-13, which sank the Gustloff, was commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko. To Soviet leadership, he was a hero. Too many Germans and neutral observers. He was the man behind the worst maritime massacre in history. And yet, the world barely speaks of the Wilhelm Gustloff. Why? Part of the answer lies in post-war politics. Because the victims were German, including former Nazis and military personnel, the Allies had little appetite to mourn them publicly. The Soviet Union never acknowledged the full civilian toll, and Cold War tensions buried the story further. Western media, too, chose to focus on Allied tragedies like Titanic or Lusitania, ships whose narratives fit more neatly into moral frameworks. The result? A disaster 6 times deadlier than Titanic, nearly erased from public memory. No Hollywood film, no museums, no annual remembrances, just silence and questions. Was this justice in war, or was it an unspoken atrocity? History still refuses to give a final answer. Despite being the deadliest shipwreck in history, the MV Wilhelm Gustloff remains largely absent from public consciousness. Why? Because its victims were German, some military, some innocent, during a time when the world was still reckoning with Nazi atrocities. Western narratives prioritized Allied losses, while the Soviet Union suppressed its own involvement. No nation embraced the Gustloff story. It didn't fit the moral clarity of Titanic or Lusitania. There were no global headlines, no memorials. The tragedy became politically inconvenient. a humanitarian catastrophe overshadowed by war guilt, propaganda, and historical silence. And so, the world simply forgot. When we think of tragic shipwrecks, one name inevitably dominates: Titanic. Immortalized in books, documentaries, and blockbuster films, Titanic has become the gold standard for maritime catastrophe. Yet, when you compare it to the story of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff, the contrast is not only shocking, it's haunting. Let's begin with size. Titanic was significantly larger. She measured about 882 feet in length and had a gross tonnage of over 46,000 tons. The Wilhelm Gustloff, in comparison, was 684 feet long with a gross tonnage of around 25,000. So no, the Gustloff was not bigger than Titanic in physical dimensions, but in terms of human loss, she far surpassed her. Titanic sank on April 15, 1912, after hitting an iceberg in the North Atlantic, killing around 1,500 people. It was a stunning loss, magnified by the presence of wealthy elites, lack of lifeboats, and the aura of invincibility that surrounded the ship. Media coverage was immediate, global, and emotional. Survivors told their stories. Investigations followed. Hollywood eventually turned it into legend. Now contrast that with Wilhelm Gustloff. She sank in wartime, under the darkness of night, carrying mostly civilians, including thousands of children. Over 9,000 people died, 6 times more than Titanic. Yet, outside of Germany and naval history circles, few even know her name. Why? Because Titanic was a peaceful voyage gone wrong, a story the world could empathize with. Wilhelm Gustloff, on the other hand, belonged to a nation that was seen as the aggressor in World War II. The victims, though mostly innocent civilians, were linked to a regime the world was eager to forget. And unlike Titanic, no romantic lore or luxury-class symbolism followed the Gustloff to the bottom of the sea. What ship was worse than Titanic? In human terms, in heartbreak and forgotten suffering, the answer is clear: MV Wilhelm Gustloff. Yet Titanic is remembered, taught, and mythologized. And the Gustloff? She remains a ghost in the cold Baltic deep, deadlier, sadder, and eerily silent. More than 70 years after she vanished beneath the icy Baltic Sea, the MV Wilhelm Gustloff still rests quietly on the ocean floor, a ghost ship frozen in time. Discovered in 1955 by Polish Navy divers and later examined more closely in the 1980s and early 2000s, her remains lie approximately 44 meters, about 144 feet, beneath the surface, off the coast of Liba, Poland. So, can you dive to the Wilhelm Gustloff? Technically, yes, but the answer isn't so simple. Although the depth is within recreational diving limits, the wreck is considered protected war grave under Polish jurisdiction. Thousands of bodies still lie entombed within her twisted steel corridors. For this reason, diving is both legally restricted and morally sensitive. The Polish government has declared the site off-limits to unauthorized exploration out of respect for the dead and due to safety concerns. What makes the dive particularly dangerous, even for professionals, is the extremely low visibility, entangled metal, shifting seabed, and unexploded munitions believed to still lie within the wreck. The Gustloff is not a neatly preserved time capsule like Titanic. Her decks are warped, her interior collapsed in places, and decades of Baltic sediment have swallowed much of her identity. A few controlled dives and robotic surveys have documented haunting images: torn lifeboats, collapsed corridors, fragments of children's shoes, and rusting railings, all cloaked in a gray silence. No human presence, no movement, just cold, watery stillness. For now, the ship remains undisturbed, not because we can't reach her, but because we choose to let her rest. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff is not just a wreck. She is a grave, and diving to her is not an adventure. It's a moment of mourning. Of all the haunting facts surrounding the sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff, none is more devastating than the fate of the children. It is estimated that nearly 5,000 children perished in the icy Baltic waters that night. They came aboard with their mothers, clutching makeshift bundles of clothes, homemade toys, and one another's hands. Some were babies just weeks old. Others were teenagers, old enough to understand that they were fleeing something terrible, but not old enough to grasp what awaited them. The decks were filled with families, many displaced from East Prussia and Pomerania, desperate for one final chance at safety. When the torpedoes struck, chaos followed. Below deck, children slept beside strangers on mattresses laid hastily on steel floors. In the darkness, amid screams and freezing water pouring in from ruptured hulls, mothers tried to carry their children to safety. Many never made it past the stairwells. Survivors spoke of infants torn from their arms by rising waters. Others remembered lifeboats overcrowded with sobbing toddlers, shivering uncontrollably as the wind froze them into silence. Few survived. One particularly haunting image from diver reports described a tiny shoe, alone near a rusted corridor, still strapped closed. The tragedy of the Wilhelm Gustloff is not just a story of war. It is a story of innocence lost. These children were not soldiers. They carried no weapons. Their only crime was being born in a collapsing world. Unlike other maritime disasters, there were no luxury names or wealthy family trees to immortalize them. No stories were written, no songs composed, just silence. Thousands of young lives, gone in the dark, with no farewell. This was not just the deadliest shipwreck. It was the quietest mass child death in maritime history, and almost no one talks about it. The story of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff is not just a tale of a shipwreck. It is a reflection of how humanity chooses which tragedies to remember and which to quietly forget. Over 9,000 people lost their lives on a single, frigid night in January 1945. Thousands of them were women and children. They were not part of any political strategy or military campaign. They were families, ordinary people swept into the chaos of a war they didn't start, crammed onto a ship they hoped would carry them to safety. But history didn't make room for them. There were no international inquiries, no trials, no films, no memorials etched into stone along the Baltic shores. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff, once a symbol of state pride, became a watery grave that no one claimed. Not the victors, not the vanquished. And so, her story slipped beneath the surface, buried not just in the sea, but in silence. Was it because the victims were German? Perhaps. Was it because the ship was militarized? Possibly. Was it because guilt politics and post-war propaganda made it easier to ignore than to grieve? Almost certainly. But here's the truth. Tragedy does not discriminate. The waters of the Baltic did not ask who was innocent, who was guilty, who wore a uniform, or who had once smiled on a propaganda poster. It simply claimed them, all of them, without mercy. Today, the Gustloff rests in cold darkness, and yet she still speaks. In twisted railings, children's shoes, forgotten artifacts, and torpedo scars. She speaks to those willing to listen, to remember, to feel. As we conclude this story, let it not be just a history lesson. Let it be a moment of reflection on war, on loss, and on the quiet cost of forgetting. Because when we forget tragedies like the Wilhelm Gustloff, we don't just lose history, we lose the humanity inside it. Let us remember her not as a statistic, not as a footnote, but as what she truly was, a floating city of the desperate, the innocent, and the lost. And for them, even if history looked away, we will not. If this story moved you, if it shocked you as it should, then help us make sure the MV Wilhelm Gustloff is no longer forgotten. Like this video, share it with someone who's never heard her name, and subscribe for more powerful, untold stories from history's darkest waters. What are your thoughts on this tragedy? Do you believe it was forgotten on purpose? Let's talk about it in the comments. Your voice helps these stories echo beyond silence. Hit the notification bell, because more forgotten truths from beneath the sea are still waiting to be uncovered.